Hey listeners, it's Jana. Welcome back to Grief Out Loud. Today's guest is physician, educator, and writer Shanda McManus, who's the author of the memoir Brother Epistles. By the time Shanda was a young adult in medical school, she'd already experienced the deaths of the three people who shaped her the most. Her mother, who died of cancer when Shanda was 14, her grandmother, who was killed by a drunk driver just 3 years later, and her younger brother Munir, who was murdered on Christmas Eve. For decades, Shanda did what so many people who are grieving do. She kept going. She took care of the practical tasks, excelled in medicine, raised a family, and boxed her grief up. But eventually, through writing, she found her way back, not just to the people in her life who had died, but also to parts of herself that had gone quiet in order to survive. Shanda and I talk about cumulative grief, sibling loss, the shame and blame that can surround a homicide death, the broader social and cultural context of loss, including how Black women aren't afforded time or space for grief, and why writing became a way to slowly enter the waters of grief, something that Shanda once feared would overwhelm her. We also explore what it means to tend to your grief over a lifetime. Okay, here's our conversation. Shanda, welcome to Grief Out Loud. It is always thrilling for me to meet people whose books I have fallen so deeply into. So I'm looking forward to talking with you about grief and about your book, Brother Epistles, and just everything else. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk to you and chat. It's just always like a privilege to get inside a reader's head and see what they responded to and what takeaways they have from the book. So thanks again for having me on.
Well, introduce us to your brother, Munir, to your mother, to your grandmother.
Yeah, well, my brother Munir, we were 18 months apart. So I don't remember being a child without my brother, and we were super close. I was the big sister, so it was my job to take care of my brother. From the earliest I can remember, that's what my mom would say whenever we went somewhere, take care of your brother. We used to travel across the city for elementary school. So I held the tokens. I kept us on track. I was like, no, we can't go in that store. We need to get on the subway. And he was always loved to joke around and poke fun. Like he's the person that can make me laugh at myself. After I was done being mad, I could laugh. And he was really good at that and super loyal. Even though he's my younger brother, he would defend me if he even thought someone was thinking something bad at me, always ready to kind of go for it. So, yeah, so that was my brother, the guy who everyone loved. He was a favorite with the ladies, of course. Sometimes I had to field interference for that. My mom, like I said, she told me to take care of my brother. And I would say my mother, she was the kind of person that you didn't mess with, especially if you're her child. If she said something, she meant it. But on the flip side of that was like a fierce, fierce love and defending. She was 24 when she was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. And, she just fought it like a champ. But she also taught me to fight, unconsciously. I have a story. I was about 5 years old or so, and I would go up the block to play with these two twins who were a couple years older than me, and they would chase me home every day. And I would run in the house and, sit in there like nothing happened. And one day I get to the door and it's locked. And my mom is in the little window at the top of the door. And she says, you better fight through the door. And I'm like, how could she? What is she? But I knew she wasn't opening that door. So I had to go back down there, and those girls jumped me. And after some amount of time, my mom opens the door. Sean, it's time to come in. And so that's the kind of person. And I thought I was going to get some sympathy when I got in the house. And she was just like, look, I better not ever catch you running from anybody, or I'm going to beat you when you get in here. And we grew up in the inner city, North Philadelphia. And I think, my mom just knew she had to teach me how to survive. And, I think that's carried me through my whole life. She passed away when I was 14 years old. I had been her helper like from ages 10 to 14. Like I knew how to do a colostomy bag, IV feedings, go to the bank, the electric company. So she really kind of empowered me, but also taught me how to survive, even when you don't know how you're going to survive. And my grandmom was the love of my life. She was only 39 when I was born. And, she was from Albany, Georgia. And my mom grew up there till she was a teenager. And that, that just deep love. I just love you because you are, And I think that was a really foundational piece, like that total acceptance. You don't have to be anything, you don't have to do anything. I just love you. She passed away when I was 17. A drunk driver hit the car that she was in. And I'm still today living on that love. So that's how powerful it was and like foundational it was to who I am today.
As you're describing each of these really foundational people in your life, and it seems like it hits such different aspects of how you've been in the world and how you've learned to do the work that you do and connect with people from, with Manir that I've got your back, you've got my back, but I make you laugh and I bring the joy and the heart. And then your mom's like, here's how we do things and here's how you're going to do things. And then your grandma is the soft landing space
Hmm.
of just the total unconditional love for who you are, no matter how you are, how you're acting.
Yep, that's it. That's it.
Given that, what was your role in your family, but also in your own sense of self through each of their deaths when you're 14, when you're 17, when you're a young adult?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because so my mom was the first, right? And I'm 14 years old. And like I said, she had empowered me to be her helper. She had been home on hospice, but I never expected her to die. Other people's mothers die that are old, but your mother, she doesn't die. And no matter the evidence was right there in front of me, but I just never believed it. And then it happened. And it just was something I couldn't even really take in, like, so when my mom passed away, I had been her right hand helper. And so I planned the funeral. I sent the death certificates out to the creditors. I I picked out the caskets, decided how many family cars. I was all of a sudden my mother's proxy in the world. And she had given me some instructions. She was just like, when I die, I do not want my casket open. If people didn't come and look at me now, they won't get to see me then. Those sorts of things. So I was all of a sudden elevated to this like really adult role. And I think for me, there was no room for me to really feel that grief. It was there, but I felt like I had to be the responsible one. I still had my brother and, I needed to take care of things. I needed to be good. And my mom was my grandmom's only child. And, kind of stepping into, I'm not your child, but I'm a child proxy. That kind of left like not a lot of room for just me to figuring out what I felt about it. And then my brother and I go live with my grandmom when my mom passed away. My dad lives next door. That's a whole complicated thing, but he lives next door. And, it seemed like my grandma makes a home for us like she always had. And, I'm 17 and I'm at a sleepaway camp for the sciences. She dies in a car accident coming to pick me up from camp. And again, it's like a shock, but it was also like, that's not fair. Hey, I already lost my mom. This is the closest thing I have. Why me? And again, I remember I was waiting and waiting all day for her and my grandpa to pick me up, right? All day. And I just knew something was wrong because my grandma would never not be the first one at the door. She had written me like this letter that says, I want to see you so bad, and sent $10. So I knew she would be there first thing, and it was getting dark. And so I got home, and the first thing I did was spring into action again. I'm the person, okay, who's the funeral home? Let's contact all the relatives from down south. Let's have the house cleaned up and in order because we're going to have a lot of. I sprang right and we went right back to that same funeral home. So here I was again without that space, because I was the strong one now. Then it's just me and my brother. When I'm my first semester medical school student and he's murdered on Christmas Eve, I felt like myself, I could just slide into this abyss. I felt totally untethered from everything. Or I could just push it away and do what I've always done, right? We had to go to the morgue. We had to meet with the medical examiner. We had the funeral to consider. There was issues of, who's going to talk to the police, all this stuff, right? And so that's kind of what grief was for me for like decades. You're responsible, you do what you have to do, and then you're strong. There was no space in that to feel all the grief. And I could say I was a little afraid because I'm just like, if I turn towards this grief, what's going to happen? How am I going to keep going to school? How am I going to do anything ever again? So I just kind of clamped it down in a way that doesn't really work like you think it works, right? It doesn't really work. In the book, I compare it to like a tourniquet, right? I put a tourniquet on that. And being a doc, it's temporary. Tourniquets should be temporary. But if you leave it on, you can lose the limb and other things. And I felt like because I shut that grief down in a way, I lost those people. I couldn't think about my brother without thinking about the way he died, without thinking about that grief. So I didn't think about him. Really, the same thing with my mother and grandmother. Don't think about that because it's going to hurt, but then you lose all the other things that that person was to you. In addition to that big log of grief that you're pressing down, it like seeps out, like nuclear waste, right? So I think, I felt kind of like these bouts of being really depressed or just really just removed from like my family in a strange sort of way. And why? Because I was cutting off this whole fountain of grief that needed to be let out and to be able to flow so I could let other things in, right? That was kind of my experience for years and years.
Was there a particular moment or a series of moments where you began to take that tourniquet off?
I think that's a great question. I think a couple things. One is I got to a place in my life that I felt secure emotionally, psychologically, financially, just like, I had a steady income, a nice house, a really supportive husband, wonderful children. I felt like, so I felt secure in that way. And then I just kind of on a whim, I took a community writing class, short essays. And I said, oh, I'm just going to take this for 6 weeks. I'm busy, 5 kids, working, running everyone here and there. And I'm like, I just want a little space for myself and my own life. So taking this writing class was a way that I tried to do that. And I was always, as soon as I started to write, it was always back to growing up, back to North Philly, back to my grandmother, my mother, thinking about my brother, moving towards them. And so that's when it started to feel maybe I can look back, maybe I can feel it. I can risk it now, because I felt like it was risky. Hey, you're doing all right. You're going to work, you have kids. Why are you going to go back and dig up all that stuff? Maybe you'll lose your mind or lose something by going back. So that was the fear, but writing let me dip into little memories, little bit like getting into some cold water, a little bit at a time. And then you get in there and you're like, you know what, this is not bad. I can let all my legs get in it. So I think that was kind of like the progression for me.
I love that image of getting into the cold water because when you do get in cold water, if you just stand sort of still in it, your body warms up the water that's right near you, and you're like,
Hmm.
okay. And then you move something and it gets freezing again, and then you sit
Yep.
still, and then it warms up again. And I just really love that idea of like entering into the grief
Hmm.
slowly, holding still, adjusting, doing a little bit more. Uh, so it's not just like jumping into the middle of the lake.
Yeah, yeah. And that's how I was able to see, okay, maybe I can handle this now. It's not so, it still hurts. But it's okay. You can cry and you're not going to spend the rest of the week crying. It's just going to be right here in these moments, and it's okay to do, you know?
Almost as if it built your confidence that you can do this grief thing in this other way. I mean, you were doing grief the whole time. It
Hmm.
just looked a certain way to be like, I can handle this. I'm going to be able to withstand
Yeah,
delving
yeah.
into it.
Yeah, I think little bit by little bit. Yes, if you've ever started an exercise program, you're like, oh, but if you stick with it after a few months, what used to terrify you, you can just go ahead and do it. And I think I kind of had to get into training for the grief. And then I was able to see the benefit, right? I was able to speak more freely to my children about their grandmothers, about their uncles, and just little things like being able to tolerate looking at pictures because for the longest I didn't have any pictures up in my house just because I just couldn't do it, you know. But yeah, little by little, I got like, a little bit of what I can I say, grief tolerance. I don't know what it is, but it kind of built. And I think for anybody out there, it's worth doing, because now I feel like I have access to the relationships, right? That I didn't for decades, because though they're gone on the other side, the relationship is still there. That love is still there. Those memories are still there. And now I feel like I can visit that land.
So, reading your book and listening to you, it might be easy to think, oh, it's just unique to Shonda that these things happened and she shut down the feelings and just performed and did all the things. But there are bigger contextual social forces that likely played into that. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question on that because and now looking back, I can see it. That whole mythology around the strong Black woman, right? You're superhuman, which means you're not human, right? So you can endure all this stuff and you come up like a shining star every time. And that's just not real. That's just not a real person. That's not acknowledging the full humanity that I should have access to. And, especially as a first year medical student, the statistics on me making it to that class, really, really small. So I felt like when I went back to school after Christmas Eve, which was like January 3rd, that I had to just do it because I already felt like people were doubting, was that an affirmative action spot? Or I don't, like it was in the air that I was doubted, that I even deserved to be in that space. So I felt that was another pressure on kind of, pushing it down in a way. And then within medicine itself, doctors have a culture, right? We see a lot of stuff, a lot of upsetting. And, the system teaches you to hold yourself back, to push that away. Be the professional. You're the doctor, my goodness. How dare you have tears in your eyes? So I think those two things compounded that for me, where I felt like I had even less space to be able to or have permission to grieve and to feel.
You wrote about how when your mother died and when your grandmother died, Manir was in it with you. Even if you
Yeah.
weren't grieving the same way, maybe you never even talked about the grief together, but it
Mhm.
was there was a person there who had gone through something similar. And then when he was killed, you lost that mirror, that reflection. And what was that like?
It was so lonely and isolating. I just like before we lost our mother, we're shoulder to shoulder sitting in the funeral. We're living in the same house that our grandma was just living in and fixing us meals and making sure we had whatever she could provide. And then all of a sudden, there's no one who lost their mother, grandmother, and their brother but me. And I just felt like I didn't have that solidarity or, that person in the foxhole or that person I could call on, Mother's Day or, the holidays where we're both feeling the exact same way because my mom loved Christmas. Love Christmas. I mean, one of the first Christmases after she was diagnosed, I had no idea. She had had a major abdominal surgery. She could hardly like walk, but she dressed up in a Christmas dress and, insisted on making Christmas for us. So all of a sudden, I don't have that part of me, that person in the foxhole. So I think that was another way that grief kind of, I didn't even want to think about it. I couldn't because I felt like I had no one who would really understand exactly what I had lost.
Almost in a way you couldn't grieve for him without him.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. I needed my grief buddy, my grief partner, because, we both lost our mother, the same mother, that same mother, that same grandmother. And so there was something really uniting and powerful in that. And then I don't even have that.
Looking back, I know you were pretty busy like boxing up the grief after your mom and your grandma died. In watching Manir, what did you see in him about how he was grieving?
That's really interesting because I've thought about that over the years and how sometimes you're so immersed in your own feelings, you don't see other feelings. And I think one of the first things I remember right after my mom died, we were in the hospital room with her. He said to my dad, What am I going to say when people ask me, where's my mother? And just feeling like everyone else has something that he wouldn't have access to. And just seeking like other ways and away from the grief. Drinking and getting high was a way, we were teenagers, was a relief. And I think that played a part for me as well as him. Somewhere to go where you don't have to look at all the things that really hurt. And I also think for him, in some way, not having his mother, and, I think all mothers, but in particular, mothers of Black boys have so much that they fill in for their sons. One, seeing them as their baby, as their child, when the outside world may have labeled them differently and don't see their humanity and don't see them as boys. And I think not having that at such a young age really, really affected my brother.
It makes me think of how you described your grandmother being that person that held you in that high regard, and to think about Manir and his relationship with your mom and how she could see him differently than how the outside world might typecast him.
Yeah, yeah. And that's so funny that you compare it like that because when we were really small, every weekend my grandma would come and pick me up and take me to her house. But my brother wouldn't go. He was little, maybe 3 or 4. And, he was super, super stuck to my mom's side. my mom was that well of unconditional, love for that's my boy, that's my baby.
In a lot of the letters that you write to Munir in your book, which is your book, is one sort of long letter to him, but a series of letters to him. It seems like one of the questions that came through so strongly was, why you and not me? And then on the other side of that, like, why me and not you? How does that questioning relate to the sense of responsibility that you felt for your brother growing up and seem to continue to feel in your
Yeah.
life?
Yeah, I think it's that older sister, that big sister. And, my mom anointed me, take care of your brother. And even when she was really sick, right? She said, take care of your brother and you guys should never be separated, ever be separated, because, we could have stayed with my dad, we could have stayed with my grandma, but she was just like, I don't care. You always stay together. So being separated, it feels like a failure or like a disobedience. We're separate, or I didn't watch out for him as carefully as I should have, because if I had, wouldn't he be alive? You know, and kind of reconciling that with who I was and who I am and what I have the power to do and not do, right? And I just think now I'm at the point where I can kind of acknowledge that. But you still feel it. You still feel that sense of, man, I did it have to work out like that? Let me go over it again. Maybe there's somewhere that if I had just this instead of that, we wouldn't be talking about it. And then also, I do feel like through this book, I really saw how there are so many structures in our society that funnel young Black men towards homicide. It's the number one cause of death, ages 15 to 24. So that's not a personal choice on one night, that's a structure. So he would have been at much more risk than me, for a lot of reasons. But really, through writing the book, I could see it where I couldn't see it before. But I just had the sense before that people blame my brother for his own murder. And I just knew that just wasn't right. I'm just like, that's not right. There's got to be more to it. And there is. So I do think, that's part of the why him and not me. It's just riskier and harder to stay alive if you're young, Black, and male in this country. And this happened in 1992 and it's 2026, and we're still seeing the same thing and having this very similar conversations about that.
I think about that a lot in terms of who who in our country gets the privilege of grieving, the space to feel and take time for their grief. And then also who gets the privilege of their person's death being stigmatized or not stigmatized. I'm not
Yeah.
that it's a privilege to have your person's death be stigmatized, but you know what I mean? Like the other side of that. And it really stands out to me with, I think about the school shooting that happened in Connecticut in 2012, the Sandy Hook shooting. And those were primarily white children from middle class, upper class backgrounds. And there wasn't a lot of questioning of like, why was your kid at that school? Why was your kid wearing that day? But then another child who's black or a person of color, why are they wearing that? Why were they at this place? Why were they
Yeah.
acting this way? And how that just permeates, well, like you said, the rates of people dying, but then also just the amount of grief that the people who are left behind are afforded or given license to have.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point because I feel like grief is a privilege. If you experience a loss, having the space to grieve is a privilege. If you're worried about paying the rent or your physical safety or food, how much time do you have for that grief? And then on top of that, there are communities like the Black communities that experience more loss because of things like gun violence, because of healthcare disparities. So on top of not having space, you have more. You bring more. I was shocked to learn that like Black children are 2 times as likely as white children to lose a parent in childhood. So that's a really thing that even grief is a privilege. And then the stigma, I'm from Philadelphia, so there's a really wealthy area outside the city, the main line. If we had grown up on the main line, my brother would not have been murdered. And if by small chance it happened on the corner of our mainline house, there would have been an outrage, an outpouring, a reporting, and a tireless work until that shooter was found, right? And plenty of space for us to feel the loss and not almost like kind of a sort of shame, blame that I got from people. And so I just think that that's something that should be out there more and recognized more because unfortunately, I'm not the only person.
Can you say more about that shame and the blame that you felt from others, either explicitly or implicitly?
Yeah, yeah. So I will say that blame, like blaming my brother for his own murder. So he had gone into the service when he was 17. He got my dad to sign him in because his girlfriend was pregnant and he wanted to provide for this baby that was coming, right? So he's in the service for a couple years. He has 2 babies. He gets sent to Iraq. He hates it. He said, Sean, if you're not white, the army ain't right. And I can't wait to get out. So he leaves the army earlier and then he comes home and it's hard to find a job. He puts in everywhere in the city, everywhere he can think. He even applied for a veterans college program at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was accepted 2 weeks after he died. So he's in this in between spot and he's like, I have 2 babies and another one on the way, and I need to support my family. It's the early 90s. And what is the support that's going on? Selling crack. And that was all around us. And that's what people did. And I felt like because that was part of the story, then it was his fault. Well, you see what happens when you do that, or he should, that whole thing was in the air. And another little caveat about that is when we're growing up in the mid 70s, my dad is one of the most successful marijuana dealers in the city, which, eventually there was a whole lot of things. Our house was robbed. He went out of the business. But he said, listen, I was just doing that until I got something better. So we had that idea that, okay, you just do this thing until you can get something better. And so I felt like because selling drugs was a part of the story surrounding the murder that we thought was related, that there was some blame and there was also shame about it. Like I knew in our house where the drugs were and I hid them and just got rid of them and I didn't say anything to anybody. So much so that people didn't really know that part of the story until I wrote it down. People thought it was a case of mistaken identity, that someone just happened to be shooting that corner that night and that my brother wasn't a target. But I knew that that was the word on the street, that that's what had happened.
I'm just picturing like a box inside of box inside of box and you with a lot of packing tape, of
Mhm,
like boxing
mhm.
up the grief and then having to box up aspects of what happened and how isolating that would be to not be able to share the full story of your brother, the love you have for him, but also how he died and the circumstances that contributed to it.
Yeah, it was very alone. And like I said, even like, I didn't even share I mean, my dad knew some parts, but he didn't know all parts. So I felt like I got all the pieces and I just held on to them.
Another part in your book that really stood out to me, you write about how through the course of your life, you've stepped away from your original voice and that you came back to it a little in the letters that you wrote to Munir and your book. So I would love to hear more about that. But also I was really thinking when you are in that grief, when you allow yourself to step into that landscape, which voice is your voice of grief?
That's an interesting thing. Yeah, I feel like, like I said, my brother was such a part of who I was, right? So I had to cut that off and actually like move on and away from everything we grew up with. I'm trying to make it. And also when I look back, I'm like, I don't want to go back to those memories. But then you're in these situations where not everyone talks like the people who you grew up with. And oh, you're moving into these professional spaces, these, upper class situations. So then there's a silencing or a censoring that automatically starts to be on you. And then you put it on, and then it's kind of like a part of you now, you know? And then when you're not talking to people from what I used to say back in the day or that part of your life, you forget even how you used to sound. And I really kind of, through the letters, I was like, finally, there it is. That's that girl. That's how Shonda Hall sounds, you know? And so that was something that was a gift of actually going back into the grief. And I think the voice of grief that I have now is something that was like muted, someone who couldn't hear and thence couldn't speak, and I feel like now that I'm allowing myself to hear that the grief is learning to speak. I can be more open. I can say it. It doesn't have to be hidden. It can be out there. Yeah, I've had this loss and it's never going to be over. And that's okay. And I can mention it. And, maybe you'll feel uncomfortable. Maybe, that's fine. But I'm able to speak on it and hold it alongside my life now, which I think is the benefit of all this, right? Like one thing to write it down, but why share it with anybody? Because I want people to see that you can hold it with all the other stuff, and that's okay.
So you've had to take a lot of tourniquets off,
Yeah.
it
Yes.
seems like. Well, and I keep going back to this idea that as you stepped into the grief and like took that step into it, you found your way back to your mom, your grandma, your brother, and yourself in a way,
Hmm.
the parts of yourself that you had to cut off along the way to survive.
Yeah. And I really, really feel that now. I just feel so much more of me. And I didn't realize it really, but um, it just struck me like in the relationship with my kids. Even my husband read the book and he was like, I didn't even know some of this stuff. I've been married to you for 30 years. What's going on? But you silence and cut out. So now I think my kids, other relationships, I'm just more. I bring more to the table. Like before I was functioning, pretty competent, but I wasn't all that I could be. And I think, you know, that has been the gift of grieving, that it's kind of powered this kind of rejuvenation of my soul, myself, my soul, that I have more to give out now, right? Because there's more there, you know?
Well, that brings me to a question about the work that you do in the world. You're a physician for many years now in
Mhm.
a space of being an educator in that realm. And what have you learned about grief from supporting other people?
Hmm. You know what I really witnessed and learned is what I said. Like grief is never over for people. We were trained on the 5 stages of grief, right? I remember that lecture. And like, okay, when you get to acceptance, it is over. And it's a time limit on that. How long has it been? Have you lost anyone in the past 6 weeks? Or, if you grieve longer than X amount of months, maybe pathological, And I think that that model isn't all there is. And I don't think that model allows for grief is like love, it's everlasting. So, and I think making space for people. to not hide it or to shut it down. I think is something that I try to do and try to pass on to my students, right? And I just saw it. I would see a patient who, you know, maybe she lost a child 50 years ago, and she comes in for her blood pressure and she brings it up. It's not over. you know, as healers, as physicians in the world, we need to pay more attention to that and kind of recognize that and give space for people to feel supported when they're grieving, no matter what the time limit, no matter what the circumstances are. Um, because I think that's part of health, right? I think, they ask you your family history and intake. They should ask you your bereavement history. What kind of space would that open up, for healing? Because grief, if left untended, can be bad. It can make you feel bad. It can make your health bad. It can make you less than physically as well as emotionally and psychologically.
I appreciate the terminology around tending your grief. In the field, we
Mhm.
talk a lot about making sure grief feels supported, but
Mhm.
oftentimes that's an other thing, right? Like I come in to support you in
Right.
your grief, which is very important. But the what do I do for myself to tend to my grief is very valuable. What are some of your practices currently? I know writing, that's your
Yeah,
place,
yeah,
that's where you
yeah,
go.
yeah. That's where I go. And it's so funny because when I write, I'm not consciously like, I'm feeling some grief. Let me write about it. But that's just what comes out on the page, right? Those people that I miss, that I love, that I want to see again. But I think a really thing for me now is that I'm allowed to cry. I give myself permission that if I feel cryy, then just cry. Where before I would shut that down, blink it away, and now I feel like, okay, that's fine. You can cry. Permission to cry is number one. And also, I think for me, attending practice is to speak of them, to say, hey, your Uncle Manir, he really used to like so and so, or he would make a joke about this situation right here. And my grandmom, she used to say XYZ, and just making them much more present in my everyday, like thoughts that I would just have and never say. Now I share them. So I think for me, that's been a very important practice that I'm still learning to do better. And even I think it's really interesting because with the people closest, like my dad, he's the other person on the planet this is close to all of this, right? With each other, we're kind of careful sometimes because I don't want to make you sad. Well, I realize you're already sad. So I'm just going to bring it up. Let's just be sad together and just be more free with, those memories or observances or that wistfulness
Mm.
that'll sometimes come upon you.
Well, I have two surprise questions for you because I just thought of
Okay.
them to close out our conversation.
Okay.
You ready for these?
Yes, I'm ready.
So I'm thinking about voice again. And what what do you imagine your mom, your grandmom, and Manir would say about your book and going so public with your grief?
It's- I thought about this. My brother would be like, "You are so crazy. I can't believe you told all of that stuff." But he would also be like so proud, like my sister, only you would write a book and share it and put it out there in the world. My mom, like one of her biggest things when we growing up is like, you better not tell my business. That was the worst crime you could commit. If you told something that happened in this house outside the house, right? So I think though, so I think I would hear a little bit about that. Tell her my business, you know. But then at the same time, like she would be so proud. That's my girl. I told you you were smart and you were special. Now see, you know, so I think, you know, being a little mad about putting all my business in the street, she would also be like incredibly proud of
Mm.
that whole thing. And my grandma would just be like, baby, that's what you needed to do. Grandmom loves you. Like my that's my grandmom. I mean, I was 12 years old and I could still sit on her lap. So, I mean, that's the kind of acceptance it. But I also think she would just be wowed with like that I have written a book. She grew up in rural Southwest Georgia. She picked cotton, she did domestic service. She didn't have that much education. So the fact that I've written her into a story that people can buy and read, I think she would just be like exploding with the pride of the whole thing.
Okay, last surprise question then. So one of the things that I really loved while I was reading your book is you bring up music and music that you shared with your brother. And so of course I had to play that while I was listening to your book
I'm so
because
glad. Yes.
that's what we do. So if you were gonna share a song for each of your people for listeners to like if they're gonna make a little playlist to listen to this interview.
Oh my gosh. So I could just give you like the fake. My grandmom loved Sam Cooke. you know, it's a wonderful world. A change is going to come. I mean, you just put on, the best of Sam Cooke, and that would be my grandmom's tunes, right? And so my mom loved that R&B soul. One of her favorite, I remember she went to the Teddy Pendergrass concert and they had given out little teddy bears. And so anything by that rich voice, she would love. And my brother, we're hip hop, early hip hop days. We love that. If I could pick one song, I can't even, but like we loved Eric B and Rakim, Paid in Full. And I think, that's talking about like monetary thing, but we're full now. A few weeks ago, his youngest son got married. And I was just looking at him and his brother and their younger sister and saying, wow, look how full what you left here has become.
Well, listeners, you now have a playlist for reading Brother Epistles by Shanda McManus. You've got to go get that book. And Shanda, if people do want to connect with you, with your work, with all the promotion you're going to be doing for your book, where can they find you?
Yeah, check me out on my website. It's just my name, ShandaMcManus.com, and everything is there. And also Instagram, Shanda MD Writes. So that's for all the current news and events and videos. So join me over there.
And you have a Substack too, as well, right?
Yes, yes, I write a Substack. It's called Weatherproof. It's dedicated to Black women's health and stories. So I'm always sharing over there too. So check me out.
Yeah, listeners, don't miss out on this. Shanda, thank you. Thank you for your book. Thank you for reaching out to me. Thank you for bringing Manir and your mother and your grandmom into my world and into the world of our listeners. It's been really educational and delightful to talk with you today.
It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for the time and the space. I've had a good time.
Well, listeners, I say this to you each and every single time, but thank you for being part of the show, for making what we're talking about here mean something. So I appreciate the times you share episodes with people, and I really love it when you reach out to me directly. So you can always email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's DOUGY.org. That's our main website. And if you head over there, you're going to find all of our free downloadable resources, information about our local programming, how to get connected with us for training and education, and of course, each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. I'm always excited to share the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Steffen Endowment Fund. Grief Out Loud is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.